Hey friends, I'm back after a significant hiatus for vacation, family time, reflection, and prayer. And I want to talk to you today about the idea of white privilege, all right? Is there such a thing as white privilege? Because there's nothing else controversial in your life right now, right? I want to ask you to consider with me for just about 10 minutes this question. And I've seen a boatload of posts recently mocking the idea of white privilege. The idea that there is a benefit to being white in our culture that is not there for African Americans. And I want to summarize all those posts for you. Some have been long, some are just memes, but I've seen a lot of different ones. And here, let me summarize them for you, okay? We didn't have white privilege. We worked hard for everything we got. Okay, those two statements are almost always something paraphrased, and are almost always included. And there's a third statement that is assumed, although not usually included. This is the assumed statement. That's almost it's there in the subtext of and the assumptions of the post. And here it is: the only difference between me and non-white peoples is that we worked harder. Okay, that's what is assumed. And everyone, you go back, look at them, review those posts, and that's the assumed, that's the under the radar assumption in all of those posts. Now, I want you to open your heart and give me 10 minutes of honest, non-defensive thinking, all right? And let's think through this together and scrutinize what we are really saying, all right? You probably recognize that it's a privilege to be born in America, right? We all recognize that. I think we look at it and say, compared to other nations, we're coming up here in this season of the year right now, it's close to July 4th, and we celebrate our American citizenship, and it would be ludicrous for us to say, we recognize this, it would be ludicrous for us to say the only difference between Americans and people born in Africa is that we worked harder, right? It would be ludicrous for us to say the only difference between Americans and any other nation is that Americans work harder. We recognize then that there are some things that we have no control over, such as our birthplace, and the system into which we are born, that are privileges, right? They are privileges, and we recognize American privilege. I think we do, and I recognize it too. I wholeheartedly recognize that that is absolutely true. Now, let me tell you then that that white privilege is a similar concept, and let's try to examine it together, okay? First of all, let me tell you two things that white privilege does not mean, okay? First of all, white privilege does not mean that you or your ancestors did not work hard. You didn't have to work hard. That's not at all what is meant, okay? That's not what is the idea is even talking about at all right? So it's not saying that you didn't work hard. I'm sure that your ancestors started with little and worked hard. I'm confident of that. Secondly, it does not mean, white privilege does not mean that you are automatically a racist. Now, I am aware that some activists or authors have said they think that is true, that you cannot ever, you're always speaking out of your white privilege and you need to just shut up. And I'm not saying that, okay? I'm not saying it. Just because some activists believe that doesn't make it true. And that's not what white privilege means, all right? It is not fair, though, to dismiss the entire idea of white privilege just because some portion of its adherents believe something that's foolish, and any more than it's right for activists to dismiss the entire police force because a few of them are not good cops, right? We agree with that. That would not be right for them to do. In the same way, it's not fair for you and I to dismiss the idea of white privilege just because a few of its adherents, or a portion of its adherents, whatever portion that is, believe something that's foolish. Let me tell you then several things that white privilege does mean, all right? Number one, white privilege does mean that your grandparents and parents did not carry the weight of the conflict and stigma of segregation and racism, all right? Your grandparents and parents did not have to carry that responsibility. Your grandparents never sat in a place like this. If you're white, your grandparents never sat in a place like this where they were not welcome. Those kinds of laws, those kinds of signs, those kinds of things were up in many places well up into the time when my father was starting to grow up. And so just so you understand, that's what's your parents and grandparents never had to carry that. Some of you, I think, would agree that 2020, the year 2020 has been heavy so far, emotionally, psychologically heavy. Between quarantines and fears of government oppression and fears of what is the government going to do and why are they going to shut our businesses down and why can't we go into places without masks and are they going to come shut our churches down? Those fears have been heavy to carry. Now, those fears are very, very similar. So maybe the first time in a long time that some of y'all have ever experienced that fear on that kind of systemic, widespread level. Now, in those kind of fears, you recognize the weight of that. Now, put yourself back 50 years and imagine that your grandparents and your parents raised you while carrying that fear. All right? So I think it's important to understand that it's a privilege to have not carried that. Number two, well, let me give you another picture there, your grandparents never saw this happen to their ethnic group, to their people, to their church members, to their spiritual or moral leaders. Not this kind of stuff. Didn't happen. Number two, white privilege does not mean your grandparents and parents, white privilege does mean that your grandparents and parents had opportunities that black parents and grandparents did not. They did have opportunities that they did not. You say, no, this is the land of opportunity. Well, let me tell you that they didn't have the option to live wherever they wanted. They didn't. Redlining, perhaps you're familiar with this concept. When the system of federal mortgage loans came up and was created to spur investment in properties, which, by the way, is the largest wealth building tool of most, as far as net worth of most American families. In that kind of context, there were a lot of people, racial people, that were racial stigma around that situation, and blacks were not allowed to go into certain places. They were not allowed to live there. Additionally, they were not allowed to get loans to live in the neighborhoods that they were allowed to live in. Realtors could lose their jobs for allowing a black person or promoting a black person moving into many communities. And the government literally would draw lines around maps like that one right there. And they would draw lines around sections of it, red lines, and say these areas are not good places for government investment in backing mortgages. It was called redlining, and it was 100% legal in those days. And it kept black people out of tremendous amounts of wealth building possibility, even those with decent jobs. All right? Because it takes a lot. If you can't borrow money to purchase a loan or purchase a house even within your community, you have a terrifically difficult time building any wealth and saving up enough money to pay cash for one of those houses, right? All right, so they had opportunities. There's much more that could be said there, but I'm going to continue on. Just that example for right now will suffice. Number three, your grandparents and parents missed some of the fears that black families carried. They missed some of the fears that black families carried. Now, let me just tell you. I'm going to tell you that you're going to see a couple of difficult pictures here, okay? But I want to encourage you not to look away. All right? Between the years of 1860 and 1960, there were, as far as we know, over 4,700 lynchings of black people in the United States. Between those years, those are the ones that we know about. Here's another picture. Note, if you will, the women and the children in the picture. This practice of lynching was designed to create terror, and it was a direct violation of civil rights, the rights of habeas corpus, the rights of right to trial and to face one's accusers, the rights of the representation that we value in our country. And it was a direct violation of those kinds of rights. This was a genuine fear. It was designed to create fear in black communities. Now, the next one here, I want to point out another. And I want you to notice that this person who did this made it into a postcard. I want you to notice that he wrote to his parents and said, "This is the barbecue we had last night." My picture is to the left with the cross over it. Wow. Do you understand that living in that kind of a world is a weight that your grandparents and your parents did not carry? That if that had happened to them, if it had happened to people that they knew, it would have been a terrifying, terrifying weight to carry. You understand that, right? There's another picture. Okay? I want you to notice the smiles. I want you to notice the cheerfulness. I want you to notice the large crowds, that this was not a one or two people who did this. It was a public situation. It was a public gathering. It was a societal process, a societal thing. And I want you to consider that when many, many people in our country went to church in those days, that some of those men went to church. They did. They attended churches and worshiped and sang songs that you know. They heard texts preached that you know about, that you hear preached in your churches. I want you to feel and carry the weight of that for a moment, because not having to live in that kind of world is part of what white privilege means. Now, I want you to continue on and say, number 4, intergenerational wealth was more possible for your parents and your grandparents. Intergenerational wealth. My great-grandparents left some property that they had bought to my grandparents. My parents had some left to them by their parents. It wasn't a huge amount, but it was a leap forward. My parents will eventually leave some to me, and I'll do the same, Lord willing, for my children. And this is great, right? It's what wise people do. The Bible is very clear about that. We leave an inheritance to our children's children. But the Bible is clear that there's more than one thing that can keep that from happening, right? There's more than one thing that can keep that intergenerational wealth building from happening. One of them is foolishness, right? Foolishness and all kinds of cultural things. Another one is injustice. Right? Injustice can prevent that natural accruing of intergenerational wealth that ought to happen in all free societies. It can prevent it from happening. And listen, it has prevented it from happening within our world, within our culture, all the way up to quite recently. It has prevented it from happening. I want you to see this chart right here. This is chart average family wealth for those who were born between 1943 and 1951 by race. Okay? So people who were born in those times, by the time they reached that gap right there, by the time they reached those ages, that's the gap between white and black wealth as compiled by the Urban Institute Survey of Consumer Finances. Now, if you don't think that is a privilege, you don't think that's partly a privilege, you're just wrong. You're just wrong. There was an enabling of intergenerational passing on of wealth. And as families have incomes continued on, and families continue to pass on those kinds of wealth, it definitely makes a huge difference. Number 5, white privilege does mean that you have never had significant numbers of laws that targeted your ethnic group. You've never had significant number of laws that targeted your ethnic group. And I will, you can do the research, go do it yourself. I'm not going to take a lot of time here. Vagrancy is one of those. Definitely targeted an ethnic group. It definitely did. And you can go back and look at the advertisements of posters. I am aware that, in fact, I saw somebody reference it the other day in one of my discussion threads. They talked about the idea of, right after the Civil War, well, didn't the government give 40 acres and a mule? Well, not really, not exactly. They gave significant chunks. General Sherman gave significant chunks of property to African American slaves who had been freed as he cut his way through the South. And then President Jackson, immediately after that, rescinded that order, took it back, and it did not happen. And so intergenerational wealth and laws began to spring up to target those specific people. Additionally, there were programs that were created that specifically exempted people the ability to continue to be taken care of. For instance, Social Security exempted agricultural workers and farmers in its beginnings. It's exempted people like that. Who were those people? They were migrant workers, they were African American workers, they were those kinds of people, and they were exempted from that program, from the program of Social Security. Now, all of this reality is here to say, and I want to finish with this one, number 6, your ethnic group. White privilege does mean that your ethnic group has never been discriminated against by the faith community. Your ethnic group was not discriminated against by the faith community. Let me see if I can tell you what I mean by that. What I mean is that we, as the church, participated in this system. We participated. We kept black people out of leadership in many circles. Many circles. We kept black people out of membership. Evangelicals did that. The First Baptist Church of Dallas, the Southern Baptist Convention, they changed their policy to allow black people to become members right before W.A. Criswell ran for the Southern Baptist Convention leadership, the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And that was when my dad was a teenager. So we have not had those kinds of situations in our groups. We have not. And so I want to tell you that it was a privilege, was it not, for my father to grow up in a place where he was not kept out of membership? It was a privilege, was it not, for me to grow up in a place where my father had not been kept out of membership, and where, let's just go a step further. If you can't be in membership, you can't get into leadership. It takes a while for membership to turn around and become leadership, especially in situations where membership was banned for an ethnic group. We have responsibility to carry in this. We do. We have a privilege that we have been given. Now, let's not pretend that all this doesn't add up to being a privilege that you were born white. Now, the question is not, should we feel guilty about that? The question is, what are we going to do with it? Because it's a fact. What are we going to do about it? What are we going to do with that? Well, let me give you this final illustration, just to kind of close off this part of it. Let me tell you what I want you to do. I want you to pick a place, and I want you to imagine that you could insert yourself as a person into this American system. And you could insert yourself as anything you wanted to be, black, white, Asian, anything. And I want you to say, in 1800, what would you have inserted yourself as, if you could pick? Okay. In 1850, right before the Civil War, what would you insert yourself as? Black, white? In 1900, what would you insert yourself? It's 40 years after the Civil War. What would you insert yourself as in 1900 when things were like they were? What would you insert yourself as in 1950 when my grandparents were having their children? What would you insert yourself as? Black, white? White. What about 1975 when my dad was 20 years old? What would you insert yourself as in that context? It's a privilege. It has been a privilege, and it still is. And that's what white privilege means. It means that for a long time, all the way up to historically, very recently, and I would argue even on into today, probably, if we fast forwarded to today and said, what about the year 2000? What would you say about that? So here's the question. What could I do about it? What can I do about it? Well, nobody except the most radical activists, and least of all me, are suggesting you go around feeling downcast and beating yourself up, and self-flagellation, is like, we're going to beat ourselves up, is the solution or is helpful in any kind of way. There might be some activists out there who would say that. I would not, and I don't think it's helpful. Here's what I am suggesting that you should do. I'm suggesting, first of all, that you should recognize it. You should be willing to recognize it, to recognize that it exists, and not argue on Facebook that it doesn't. I don't think that's helpful. I don't think you should beat yourself up about it, but I don't think you should argue that it doesn't exist. Number 2, I think you should admit it, even publicly. I think you should be willing to do that. Number 3, I think you should be thankful. I think you should be thankful for it, because I don't feel like just beating yourself up in guilt is really helpful to anyone, them or us, right? Black people or white people. I think you should be thankful. And then, fourthly, I think you should use it as a foothold to bless somebody around you. You should use the privileges we have as a foothold to bless someone around you, somebody maybe that didn't have it. You see, a lot of times, injustice accrued over generations has meant that the angst and the brokenness continues and passes on. And so in cultural memory, much pain and difficulty is held. What if you crossed the line because you're so privileged? What if you crossed the line and said, I'm going to cross this line, and I'm going to reach out, and I'm going to love somebody across that line. And I'm going to find a way to give them a hand up into my place of privilege. I want to work not to say, let's denigrate or bring ourselves down, but to say, how can we help lift somebody up because we're so privileged? And I think that's a hard conversation. It's difficult. Those are difficult things to think. I think it's important. All right? God bless you. See you next time.